Good morning. My name is Kyra McGlynn. I'm the lead school social worker for Northeast Metro 916, primarily housed at Cora Secondary School. Today I am joined by Kevin Horst, our mental health specialist, and I'll invite him to introduce himself in just a moment. But we are going to be talking to you all day today about trauma-aware care. We're going to start off with our first session, which is just an overview. We plan to get into these concepts in more in depth very shortly. Unfortunately, we cannot be together, which really is disappointing. This material is wonderful when given live because there is that reciprocal back and forth. Unfortunately, given the circumstances of COVID, we are electing to do this virtually. So we do hope that we will keep it spicy and engaging and entertaining for you. So bear with us and we will all get through this together. So our objectives for this session are just to give you a better understanding of the importance of trauma-informed practice, identify some key components of trauma-informed practice, and identify strategies to expand and assess trauma-informed practice. So it sounds lofty, but we will get there. As I said earlier, my name is Kyra McGlynn. I have been with our district about 8 years. This would be the point in a presentation if we were live where I would disclose that I tend to talk fast and that you are encouraged to yell at me if I'm talking too fast. Now, because we are not live, you might have to slow me down by pausing and going back to a concept. I'm going to try really hard, though, to be slow. Other things. I think I'm really funny. Just because we are not live and you cannot laugh, which would typically encourage me more, does not mean that during our lovely COVID time, I have not been able to fully immerse myself in being funny and laughing at myself. So I am really good at thinking I'm funny. I apologize in advance. And I also probably should have some kind of learning plan around saying the word when I present. Again, it's something I'm working on. Please don't take account. It would be highly embarrassing. I think that was my full disclosure introduction. Kevin?
I'm Kevin Horst. I'm the mental health specialist for Northeast Metro 916. I primarily work with the middle school and high school age scholars or students. I do a little bit with the elementary age kids as well. I'm a licensed psychologist, so that means I'm a psychologist, but not the school kind, the weird kind, that people are more likely to make jokes about. And when Kara says that it's okay to yell at her, it is because people want to do that all the time. And most of the time, that's because she is going so fast. And in that period of time, she accomplishes much more than any two people. True.
Thanks, Kevin. I don't know if I'm flattered or.
Well, you should be flattered.
Thank you. Darn, I ummed. So here we are. Thank you so much, Kevin, for that lovely introduction. That was very kind. And we would look forward to meeting you at this point. However, given, again, the distance thing, we are going to do this a little bit different. If you have not already done so, please open these slides up in an app called Pear Deck. In that presentation app, it will give you the ability to respond to some of the questions we'll be presenting throughout the presentation. So Kevin and I will be able to go back in after you're done, and we'll be able to connect with you about any questions you have, concerns, aha moments, really anything, even if you just want to share who you are and where you work. So Kevin and I can look out for you and you have a friendly face in the district. So please do open this in Pear Deck, and we look forward to reviewing your responses when you're finished with these 5 sessions. Before we get started, we are going to just do a brief grounding activity. At this time, I invite you to sit firmly in your chair with your feet about width apart and your back, so at least your upper back is cradled. You can gaze ahead gently, or if you feel comfortable, I would invite you to close your eyes. This time, I'm going to invite you to intentionally inhale through your nose to the count of 6. Hold your breath for 2 counts, and exhale through your mouth to the count of 6. Please go ahead and take a few more breaths, inhaling on the count of 6 through your nose, holding for 2 counts, and exhaling through your mouth to the count of 6. Please bring your attention back into the space. Open your eyes if they've been closed. Hopefully no one's nodded off on me yet. So the first question that we're going to ask you, and that this is interactive again, is what did you notice about how this kind of breathing made you feel? So throughout this presentation, what we're going to be doing in a lot of our activities is two-part. It's modeling ideas for you to bring into your classroom spaces, regardless of what your educator role is in the district, as well as hoping to support your own self-care. So hopefully this is relaxing and centering. And again, we're really interested in knowing how this made you feel. So please do answer that question on Pear Deck, which leads us into the next thing on Pear Deck, which is inviting you to either draw or type 2 things you already know about today's topic. So we really care about the collective wisdom that our education providers bring to our district. It's so important. So we're really curious, what do you already know? And if it's nothing, no shame. That is totally okay if these concepts are brand new. And if you've worked in various systems that trauma-aware care has been a part of your practice, again, we want to know. This is to support us in getting a gauge, but also as we follow up, it will help us identify different areas in which we can foster further conversation. So please pause here, fill this out, and when you're done, hit play again. Okay, so why do we do it? It is trauma-aware care. Why are we as 916 troubling with this? Why is literature troubling with this right now? If you have had any sort of educational or clinical training, regardless if it was in mental health or physical health, you have heard the buzz about trauma-informed care. Why is this so important? It's so important because trauma impacts a lot of people. And the way we set up the system and circumstances in order to support them really is the make or break difference. And if we are able to connect with them in a genuine, authentic, healing way, or if we further add to that re-traumatization. So I know I'm putting a lot on your shoulders and we haven't even been together for 5 minutes. But again, don't worry, we're going to walk you through how to do this. And just know this work is not meant to be done alone. You are going out to sites with fantastic teams. Lean into those teams, build those relationships with your peers, even if we're in this hybrid or distance model and you're not able to connect face to face. Do what you can, and they will be there for you as well to try to build those relationships and cross the bridges of technology. But by having those relationships, it will give you a firm foundation so that when this work gets hard, because it will, you have people to lean into, because that's what makes us all stronger. So the impact of trauma on our students, if you're at Cora Secondary Site, we use the term scholars when we talk about our learners and families. We know because of research that a lot of people have at some point in their life either witnessed and or experienced trauma. And we'll get into what trauma is shortly because it can be highly subjective. We also realize that systems in particular, schools, government, healthcare, those big systems that everyone interfaces with at some point in their life, again, those are prime to either set an example for what authentic, kind, healing, relational care can look like, or they can re-traumatize. So it is imperative that we as trauma-aware systems, and as 916, it is one of our pillars of care, that we are highly aware of the why. You need to be conscious. Because again, how you show up every day makes or breaks in those small moments. But the bigger thing is we have to be in this together, trying, right? Because if we're not trying, then we run serious risk for doing harm to our kids. And that is the last thing anyone in education wants to do. You are all here because you care about kids and we want to foster that and give you some tools. We also recognize that there is an impact of trauma on staff. And you will hear about it quickly. You might see it if we are in school in person within the first couple of weeks. People experience primary traumatic stress, which is when something happens directly to us, and people experience secondary traumatic stress. And we'll get more into this in session 5, so I won't break down the nuance, but basically secondary is just around being around people who've experienced traumatic experiences and having to hear about it all day long. So we recognize that our families and learners are impacted. We recognize that our staff are impacted either while at the job or even prior to. People might be coming to us with trauma histories or experiencing trauma in parallel to working with us. We realize that as an organization, we are not as strong if we do not only identify the impact of trauma, but actively work to support against the outcome of trauma. So as an organization, we are committed to mitigating the impact and effects of trauma. And it is imperative that in all of this work, we're including those systems outside of our school system and our communities and families. So this isn't work we do to people. This is work we do with. That is all work, actually, including education. You don't do to, you do with someone. So this is an invitation to join as a collective community and see how we can build collective resilience and heal when hard things happen. Right now, coming back to school after the summer, there are some really immediate, evident, hard things that are happening in our community and in our world. We have a pandemic that is internationally impacting people, that is traumatizing for some. We also have the murder of George Floyd and the racial violence and unrest that has really been present in our country for 400 years and is being pulled into sharp relief in our communities at this time. So those things are not just weighing on you, they're weighing on our system, on our other staff, and on our kids and families and community. So in order to mitigate that sort of toxic stress, we have to work together in community to make things better, to collectively support one another. And again, that all starts with relationship. Okay. So as I was saying, I was going to get into the definition of trauma. So I invite you, if you're really interested, take a moment here, hit pause and read. I'm not going to read this to you. I'm just going to hit the highlights. Basically, in order for something to be a trauma, right, in that clinical way that it's diagnosable and treatable, we need to have 3 elements. We need to have an event, an experience, and an effect. An event is something that many people can have in common, but their experience, be it positive, negative, supportive, invalidating, etc., that's what's going to make or break the effect so that that person ends up with the outcome of trauma or not. Hopefully not, because in that experience, they are surrounded by caring, loving people and systems that can mitigate the event. The event is scary. It is something that you think is going to take your life. And again, it's subjective because every person has a different understanding of what that could or couldn't look like. So I love to use the example of going for a walk. So Kevin, how do you feel about dogs?
I like dogs better than people, which is sometimes disadvantageous in my line of work.
Y'all, you're getting like full disclosure presentation today. Thank you, Kevin. So
You could maybe edit that out, maybe.
maybe we'll see. We'll see the final cut. This is the Kara director's cut. I should also warn you all of that. So the event, Kevin and I are out for a walk. Kevin loves dogs more than people. And we pass a house in which we have the event of two dogs jumping and barking up the fence. Kevin, what do you think when you see these dogs jumping and barking up the fence?
They want to, I know this is going to sound weird, but they want to have some sort of a relationship. And in this case, it means they just want to be petted.
Okay, perfect. It didn't sound weird. It sounded like a psychologist. So congratulations.
It's a weird thing.
So in the same event, Kevin and I are together even. Because of my past experiences, maybe I've been bitten by a dog, so I have a prior trauma, and maybe I was hospitalized or treated. Maybe I have no history or experience to draw from with an animal. So this is my first time interacting with a dog. So when we walk away from this event, Kevin feels very excited. He's had this opportunity to develop a relationship with new dogs. I'm scared because I really thought my life was threatened when they were jumping up that fence. They could have bit me. Worse, maybe they wanted to eat me. If I'm a little kid, you really think animals are going to eat you sometimes. And then in that experience, Kevin goes home, and Kevin has supportive, loving family members, and he tells them, oh yeah, my walk today with Kara. Yeah, I got to see these two cute dogs. It was awesome. He moves on with his day. Maybe I go home, and this is not the case, but just for this example, but I go home and I don't have anyone to talk to because maybe I don't have anyone available to me because they're stuck within their own mental health or substance use issues. Maybe no one's available because they're working multiple jobs in order for us to survive. Perhaps when people are available, they invalidate my experience. Oh, that was so stupid. Why are you afraid of dogs? What's the matter with you? So then I start to even question myself and how I understand the world. I don't feel good about it. So the effect is Kevin and I had a great walk for Kevin. For me, maybe I start having nightmares about the dogs and I can't sleep and I start thinking about them all the time. And my functioning is impaired on a mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual level. I have a trauma. Again, totally made that up, but you can see how from the same event, depending upon what people experience after, really makes or breaks how a person interprets that event and what that lasting effect is on them. Okay, so some just overview data about trauma is based on knowledge and understanding of trauma, it has far-reaching implications. So what SAMHSA is saying here in this research is that things that happen to us in our life that are traumatic, if they are not addressed, then the implications can carry throughout our lifetime. And that really speaks to a study that Kevin's going to speak more specifically about, but regarding the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was developed by Anda and Folletti in the 1990s. So again, Kevin will talk a little bit more about that, but just briefly how it connects here is it connected how trauma impacted long-term health and mental health for people. We also know from research that strengths-based framework, which is the framework at 916 we are desiring to use in every scenario. We want to build on what people do well, right? It's grounded in this understanding, though, and responsive to the impact of trauma. You can't know what people do well without knowing a whole person. So this comes back to it is imperative for us to develop relationships with one another and with our kids so that we're able to create opportunities for people to develop a sense of control and mastery and power. Education's about mastery. When we look to do assessments on students at the end of a unit, we're not looking to see what they don't know. We want to know what they know. And in order to know what they know, we have to figure out first who they are if we want to know in an authentic way. I certainly have some feelings about how, a test in and of itself is not a capture of knowledge, right? It's just this like snapshot. I'm inviting you to take more than a snapshot to figure out how you can build a sense of control and power and mastery with your learners in your classroom spaces and places. Okay, so because we are in a school, what we're doing is different than trauma-specific treatment. We do not have all of our teachers certified as therapists, is basically what this is getting at. So we are going to be talking about skills that will support you in developing relationships with all kids. And if a child has an experience or history of trauma, this will also help them maybe a little bit more. So these are just best practice behaviors and interventions that we're going to be focusing on. We're not going to be focusing on dialectical behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral therapy, though we might borrow some things from them. We are going to be just focusing again on general skills work. We are going to think about how trauma impacts the systems. So you're a part of that system. So how do we function and how do we set up our environment? How do we train our people? How does that improve or worsen trauma-related issues? We're also going to talk about the awareness of disparities related to racial and ethnic identification, LGBTQ+ identification, homelessness, socioeconomic status. So I'm going to push this a little. This material, it was noted on the first slide, and I didn't talk about it. This material was developed by a third-party consultant through Clearwater Consulting named Pete Singer. And Pete has put together these slides. We've tweaked them slightly, but some of the pieces on the slides don't necessarily get into all of the things Kevin and I have to say about them. So there are times where we will kind of go on what I call them a soapbox talk. So I'm going to hit a soapbox talk right here. So now you're fully informed and you have my disclosure. It is more than just an awareness of disparities. When we're thinking about trauma, especially in how it has implicitly impacted persons that are Black, Indigenous, persons of color, persons of the LGBTQ+ community, we are talking about unpacking a historic and intergenerational trauma that has affected people for decades, or if not hundreds of years. And, because there's always the both, and it is just as detrimental and overtly bigoted to assume because a child is Black, Indigenous, a person of color, LGBTQ+, that they come to us with trauma, like big T treatable trauma. So we need to be very conscious in our interactions of the both and that starts with really thorough work on yourself. You need to know, in order to do trauma informed care well, about your own values, about your own culture. What do you bring? So a part of really authentic trauma-aware care is elevated cultural consciousness and an ability to lean into that. So I invite you, in our district, we have really amazing opportunities for that in our equity work. Join our equity work. Come along with that. Lean into the hard conversations. Get uncomfortable. It will only better you as an educator and help you in this work. Okay, so continuing on about the 3 E's. So event, experience of the event, and the effect we've already gotten into. Awareness of the biological impact of trauma. So we're going to spend a whole session 2, talking about brain development and how our brains develop bottom up. It's not like an economic top-down type thing. Yay, Reaganomics, sorry. It is bottom up. So when we are building a house, we start at a foundation. When we're building our brain, we start on survival. So remember that house thing, I will come back to that. The ACEs study. Well, maybe I misspoke. Kevin, did I misspeak? Were you going to talk more about this, or am I talking about this?
You were doing this part.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. For some reason, I had in my head you were. Okay, so I started alluding to this a little bit earlier, but the ACEs came from a merging of a public health professional and a doctor in California, Anton Folletti. They came together and they realized in their own experiences that they were seeing a lot of people have high blood pressure and obesity and diabetes who also had fairly significant experiences of what they labeled as adverse experiences, traumas, in their early years. So they did a longitudinal study in the 90s following a cohort of upper middle class, college educated, predominantly white folks in California, looking at how those early adverse experiences impacted their later outcomes related to health and well-being. The original survey was 10 questions, and those questions were focused on things like, has anyone in your household ever hit you? Has any member of your household ever been incarcerated? I would invite you, if you're not familiar with the study, just to quickly Google the ACEs questionnaire. It will come up for you right away, and you can see what those 10 questions are. Now, in 2015, because as I said earlier, that this initial study was normed on white middle-class Californians, the city of Philadelphia in 2015 was interested in replicating this study. However, they felt that the study in and of itself, when it was initially normed, was not inclusive enough of other experiences, such as racism or bullying, or what it feels like to live in a community that's not always safe. So they expanded the ACEs study by adding 5 more questions to the questionnaire. And again, those were all focused on what person's experiences were related to living in a community, as opposed to just in their family, and how adverse experiences in the community also can be traumatic. So we actually were able to replicate the study with our students, and we will be talking about that more in depth shortly. But that is just a brief overview of the ACEs. Kevin, did I miss anything you wanted to say?
No, I think we'll get to it. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me is that I am obviously, I've been in the field kind of a long time. And one of the things that I think about a lot is that not knowing about this ACE study and its impact on people, had I known that earlier, I would have done things a lot differently than I do. And once being aware of that, it's really a game changer, not only kind of in the therapeutic field, but also for anybody who cares for children.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. The last big concept here is epigenetics. So this comes from public health and epidemiology, and it is the theory that there is genetic transmission in our DNA. So when they began looking at this research, they looked at mama rats. So they took 2 rats. One had a typical rat pregnancy, right? So they were fed, they were sheltered, they were not stressed at any point. Things were pretty on the up and up for them. The other rat in the lab condition was placed under intervals of stress that were unexpected. So the rat itself could not prepare for that stress. It was toxic, pervasive stress. The rat was also food insecure, and the safety of their shelter was often jarring to the rat. So I think maybe there are some like electrodes and things in there. I hate animal studies. Sorry. So if you see my face, that's what that's about. And What the research found was when both of these rats had full-term pregnancies, the rats from the mom, the pups, who had a typical rat pregnancy with no extraordinary stress, those pups were able to thrive. They met developmental milestones. They were able to find mates, no issues. The rats that did not experience the stress themselves, that they were born to the mother who had been placed under extreme stress, those pups grew to be rats that were very skittish. They failed to thrive when we were looking at developmental milestones. They didn't mate. They were not able to pair off, and they were also easily bullied. Which was interesting because, again, they themselves did not experience that primary trauma. So there's some question marks around this research still, around what that transmission looks like. But I think we can infer with our knowledge base that if our parents experience really hard things, that's likely going to impact and impair their ability to parent. The upside, though, to this, and I'm always going to try to put an upside on these, is that with epigenetics, just like we might be able to have the transmission of traumatic experiences, we also can transmit resilience. We're going to really talk in depth about what resilience is, but there is certainly collective intergenerational resilience in people, and resilience is developed in those integral relationships in our families. So you might even be thinking yourself about hard things that your caregivers went through and also how they were able to navigate it. And the ways that they navigate it model for you what that intrinsic resilience looks like so that when you're confronted with hard things, you're better able to navigate. So epigenetics can impact our biology, and it can impact it adversely or positively, and sometimes more often than not, a little bit of both. We also seek as a system, we've talked about this, to reduce re-traumatization and secondary traumatic stress. And then just from a systems perspective, it might surprise you, but this is cost saving to Northeast Metro 916 and all of our member districts for us to be trauma informed. Because when systems are trauma informed, people tend to need less sick days, and Kevin will get into some of the impacts of that in session 5, but basically we retain staff are healthy and thrive, kids are healthy and thrive, communities are happy. It's a good thing. So as I just alluded to, we did replicate these ACEs studies at our sites. So it was actually done twice. So if you're looking at this data, you might be a little confused. When you see on the bar graph, the kind of reddish brown that is all the way to the right, that is the number from the original 1990s ACEs study, as far as their breakdown in their population of persons that took the study. If you look all the way to the left, you will see a bar that says CVC and a bar that says BEC. So originally when we replicated this study, 916 looked different. We had 2 high school, middle school sites. So these numbers are from the 2 high school, middle school sites, Capitol View Center and Bel Air Education Center. At the time, their population was middle and high school. As you will notice, especially as you look to the left-hand side of the bar, or right-hand side of the bar graph, 4 or more kind of cuts off. Here's the why. When a person has 4 or more of that 10 adverse experiences, that's when it's really problematic. That is when research has shown us that the outcomes for their health are incredibly impacted, as well as their social, emotional functioning in the community. Persons with 4 or more ACEs are more likely to be incarcerated. They're more likely to drop out of high school. They're more likely to have teenage pregnancy. So when we did this study, and we're not surprised to see this, but I think it really helped us formulate for our student body just how imperative and immediate this work had to be. We couldn't wait to do trauma-informed work. The trauma was there. It was on us then as educators that were responsive to figure out a way to support our kids. We replicated this study one other time using the updated Philadelphia ACEs when Cora became a secondary only center. And that is the number you will see in green. The caveat to all of this data is our students, just like the regular population, underreport. It is fair to assume each of these columns, except for maybe the 0, is slightly higher than the actual data that we were able to collect. And if you think about that in terms of the data we were even able to collect, it's pretty jarring in terms of what you're thinking about as you're going into your sites.
Cara, would you back up that
Sure.
slide a little bit? So I really like thinking and talking about this slide, not because it's fun or anything like that, but that it's so important. I think Cara mentioned that students tend to underreport, and I know that that's true because I've seen I've helped kids with some of the language on some of the items, and I know their histories well enough to know for sure, for example, that they were physically abused by a caregiver. And it's not uncommon that they will say no. And then like later on, like in a session when I'm talking to them, I'll say, help me understand that. And they'll typically say something like, well, that's really not abuse. That's just kind of how everybody is. Mm. So they come to see the world in that way, and the world becomes for them different from many people's experience. And so that underreporting leads to other things also. In addition to, Cara mentioned some of the health things. One of the biggest impacts that affects both our kids and us as staff is that people who experience trauma develop different relationships with the entire world and with people in the world. And since we're people in the world, they come to us with a set of expectations. And many times that set of expectations includes that we are going to be harsh and punitive people. In their minds, we have already failed them to some degree because their lives have been so difficult. Not unlike the difference between Cara's and my experience with dogs. They are the people for the walk. We are the dogs. I like that.
That's really good.
I like being a dog. And so many of the kids that come into our schools see us, and we can have on our friendliest Cara McGlynn smile and have our fuzziest Fred Rogers Trust Me sweater, and they will still see us as a threat because that's what their experience has been. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. And I just want to add to that. That is not to say, though, that over time, we can't change that experience for them and we can't earn their trust. And it really just comes, though, with spending the time and having those reparative experiences over and over and over again. We'll get into that more later, but it's really hard at first because kids aren't ready to accept that we have good intentions. So I think that's perfect. Thank you, Kevin. The last thing I want to mention on this data too, Kevin kind of reminded me about, is that while this is important for us to be aware of, especially as we're beginning to initiate trauma-informed systems, it's also really important that we don't get mired down or stuck here. It's really easy to look at this and feel overwhelmed or that we can't do anything. If you take nothing away from today, please take away the fact that you can do something. You are a change maker, and in your relationships with kids, you play a vital role in mitigating the long-lasting impacts of trauma. I'm going to spend a ton of time in our next session talking about the brain and talking about this brain scan in particular. So just briefly, you will notice that the brain scan of the person on the left is a typical neurotypically developed brain. The brain scan on the right is a person who has experienced abuse, trauma, and there are portions of their brain that don't light up on the scan. So they are either underdeveloped or at this point, maybe just not available to them because our brains develop bottom up. So their amygdala response, that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, is likely overdeveloped in the instance of the person on the right, which has not allowed them time to develop those temporal lobes, which are imperative to learning. So when children's behavior feels like a won't, and this is some Ross Green for you, I invite you to change that framework. It's a can't. And if nothing else, think about this brain scan. They literally do not have the brain capacity yet developed to do the skills that you're asking them to do. The cool part about the brain, though, is that the brain heals itself and continues to develop throughout our life. So, with safe, supportive, caring, authentic relationships, you are able to move toward that left-hand side brain that is fully developed and help restore kids to a more normative developmental trajectory in their brain development. That's pretty awesome. This is kind of a disclaimer. Just thinking about, since people respond to trauma differently, trauma-aware care looks different for different people in different settings. You are all coming to us with experiences outside of 916, and you might be aware of trauma-informed practices. That's awesome. We invite your collective wisdom, and the way we do things is how we have found it to work best for our students so far. That's not to say we don't have a lot to learn. It is to say, though, what we do here might look different than what you've done in other places, and that's okay. So this is an invitation just to learn new things and be curious about our systems and use your prior knowledge in order to inform our system. And with that, I pass it over to Kevin.
The sanctuary model it's just that. It's a model that talks both about very specific kind of interventions and ways to be with people who have experienced trauma, and it emphasizes, in addition to the very specific kind of things, more of a general way of thinking. Trauma-aware, trauma-informed care is much, much more than just a cookbook of responses. When a student does this, we do this. I have a brother-in-law who had a really, really good quote that's kind of fitting. We were working on something, and I can't remember what it was, but I said something like, we just kind of really have to make this idiot proof. And he looked at me and he said, as soon as you make it idiot proof, they will build a better idiot. And that fits in this case. I'm not calling anybody idiots, as far as you know. But the reason that I think that fits here is because as soon as we come up with an intervention to address a sort of behavior or a series of behaviors, a different behavior will appear, and therefore we have to not even think about having the ability to do an if-then. We have to have the ability to have a mindset that can respond to all of the different sorts of behaviors and emotions that are presented to us in the normal course of the day. And many of those things, certainly the most difficult of those, are driven by trauma experiences that scholars or students have had. So there's a group called that came up with the sanctuary model, and it's based upon how children make attachments and child development. And there are 4 pillars, and they're listed there. And the shared knowledge is primarily related to knowledge about people, and not just how people are, but how people are in groups and how they respond to different experiences. And Kara talked a fair amount about that, about how some people will experience something and it will have a very, very different impact on them than it will other people. An example of that came to my mind when Kara was talking is I have relatives. I have a fairly large in-law family, and watching my in-laws respond to their children has been really interesting. If one of them, if a child falls down, one of my in-laws will respond to that child by rushing over there and saying, "Are you okay? Okay, you must be hurt. That must have been terrible." And another one will wait and see whether or not the child is hurt, or say something like, "You're okay, you're okay." And then if they indicate they're not okay, then they'll go in with nurturance. And I think that's really important, because it's important for us to respond to what's happening with kids and not to put that on them and come with the expectation that they're going to have a difficult time experiencing something. Because if we do that, we'll inadvertently convince them that they should be having more of a trauma response than they may have. Another part of it is groups, and shared knowledge and a common understanding or a common belief about how people are in groups and how groups are supportive of each other or not supportive of each other. One of the things that Kara talked about earlier on was the importance of staff people supporting each other and being available to each other. And that's important not only for staff people to get support, which we really, really need from each other, but also kids are watching us. So when we are supportive to each other, what kids see is people in that setting being helpful to each other, and that's an indirect message to them that this is a place where you can also get support. And we're going to be that way with each other, and we're going to be that way with you. That's a kind of a lesson that takes a very, very, very long time to sink into kids and for them to be able to trust that, but it does happen. I've been in the district about a little over about 6 years, which is not a long time given kind of how long my career has been. But in that period of time, I have seen kids where all of the staff thought that the prognosis of the outcome of that student was going to be really, really difficult. And over time, things changed. And a lot of that occurred because we had a belief in what we were doing, and we had a shared knowledge about what our beliefs in what made people better, and that really did have an impact over a period of time. Another one is shared values. The Sanctuary model talks about shared values and how that's important, because with shared values, we can have a common goal. And our goal is not, or at least my goal or our goal is not always to have kids turn out exactly the same way, because they're not going to. We all have different capacities, and we all have different interests. And a shared value in this case refers, I believe, to seeing our students achieve both their potential and having the ability to pursue whatever interests they want to. So many of our kids want to go into developing video games, and that's great. If they want to do that, that's wonderful. Also, many of them want to be auto mechanics, and that's also wonderful. And so the value is not being a certain thing, but the value for us is, I just took one of Kara's becomes getting them to the point where they want to be. A part of that all happening is a shared language. One of the things in the elementary schools that I really smile about all the time, and I've kind of thought about it for years and years, is the word inappropriate has been largely expunged from the vocabulary in 916 schools, and I think that's a really, really wonderful thing. Inappropriate has this baggage that comes with us, and the implicit message is that you're wrong. One of the words that has replaced inappropriate is unexpected. So when somebody, particularly, and this is more at the elementary school, a little bit more than at the high schools, but one of the things they'll say was, "Oh, that was unexpected." and that's taught to the kids, and the kids know that unexpected means that that's not a thing that really fits in that particular situation. And so they learn that that behavior doesn't fit in a situation, not by being told they were wrong, but by being told that they were unpredictable. Shared practice is somewhat similar to that, and that's we all have a certain set we have a set of behaviors that we continue to do, and that includes some of the language that we use, but we do things the same way so that we can be as predictable as possible. Because for people who have been traumatized, safety it can't be overemphasized how important safety is. And when we are predictable, we become safer. Parallel process is this, it's a process and it's a dynamic that occurs at multiple levels. And if this job does anything, it teaches us about ourselves. It teaches us how we respond to things under stress. It teaches us what kinds of things, sometimes kind of weird things, that we can find joy in. And so an example of parallel process might be, here's mine. When I experience or watch a child being bullied by another child, I have to work really, really hard to respond to the bullying person in as kind a way as possible, because that triggers me, because I got a little bit of that as I was in high school. And so that's one of those things that kind of brings me back to high school. And there were just a couple situations where I got bullied. And so when that happens, I react. And so it's very important that I don't act toward the bullier in the way that the bullier is acting toward that victim at a time. And the only way that we can be aware of those things is really explore our own responses to things and our own value systems and our beliefs about those things. So anything you want to add on that, Cara? That felt clumsy. Okay.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think you captured everything.
Okay, thanks. Next slide. The SAMHSA model, I had to look this up just this morning. SAMHSA stands for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And this is this great big government bureaucratic thing that really does some good things. The good thing about that is trauma-informed care in a relatively, I want to say, 10-year period of time has become not only a thing that's recognized as important at very local levels, but also at a national level. So SAMHSA has this model that encourages people to realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand not only what trauma is, but how people recover from trauma, recognize the signs and symptoms in clients, family, staff, and others. And a real interesting thing is that we recognize and see the impact of trauma in kids every single day. A thing that's important to remember is that kind of behind that are families who have also been traumatized, often for the same kinds of reasons. Carr mentioned some of the things that's going on in the societal atmosphere, particularly in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And the same things that are traumatic experiences for our children are also traumatic for their parents. More recently, I've had more conversations with moms about their fear for their non-white kids being killed or hurt by police. And so the kids are not only experiencing those traumatic experiences from the things that they see, but it's also kind of embedded in their families at some level. The SAMHSA model also emphasizes responding by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies and procedures. So it's not only what you do with that individual in front of you, it's also what you do with your entire organization and even your community to address trauma. So it's both that kind of micro and macro level. Resisting re-traumatization is an incredibly important thing in our settings. All of our kids are in schools where they don't have any contact with non-special education kids. And that's important because that means that they're all coming to us with a set of difficulties from their regular school district. And in order for them to grow, it's important that we are aware of when we may be re-traumatizing them, or they may be re-traumatized in our setting. One of the best examples of this is when kids are in their classroom and there's a big commotion in the hallway, and there might be two kids in the hallway starting to fight. It might be logical or natural to think that people who have been abused would shy away from that situation, and the last thing in the world they would want to do would be get out into the hallway, because that's where the commotion is and that's where they might get hurt. But many, many times, and probably more often than not, their impulse is to go to the door for two reasons. And one of those is to find out what's going on, and the other is to see what's going to be happening in that situation, because they're going to have to know what staff response to that is. Because if the staff can keep that situation from escalating too far, that's a message to them that they're going to be safe, and kids need to be safe. Next slide. So some of I've talked about some of this already. The safety one I talked about, that's a key principle of SAMHSA. Another one is trustworthiness and transparency. Children need to be able to develop a relationship with us and trust us, because without them feeling safe with us, they are not going to be able to take the risks that we're asking them to take. We're asking them to do as a part of their daily life in our schools, to do something different, because some of the mechanisms that they have used to cope in the past haven't worked for them. Easiest example is when somebody makes them mad, they become abusive to them and might sock them. And so we're going to say things like, it's not helpful, it's not good for anybody. If you do that, try this. Use your words and say, don't do that, stop that. And in order for them to continue to do that, or even to try that, they have to know that we are trustworthy enough that if it goes south and it doesn't work, they need to know that we'll be able to bail them out. Part of trustworthiness, it's not that easy, includes transparency, and that's just being honest with them. And so, particularly, a real example for this period of time is the whole COVID thing. We cannot honestly tell kids that they are not going to get COVID, and we can't tell them that their parents are not going to get COVID. They will very, very quickly realize that we're not telling the truth, and that will compromise our ability to work with them. They're not going to trust us, and if we do that, they shouldn't trust us. However, we can say things like, yep, that's a real thing, and here are some other things that's important for you to know. Here's what we're doing to keep you safe. We are doing a ridiculous amount of cleaning. We are going to have people wear masks. We're going to do social distancing. Your mom is taking good care of herself. And another thing is the whole age group thing. You are not in an age group where it's likely that that's going to impact you. So we can say things like that, and at the same time, we can't totally take that away. But our honesty can include this is the thing you have to think about. These are the things that really, really do mitigate the risk of this happening to you. And then there's going to be a video that you're going to be shown, and maybe even twice, where it's not about the nail, that talks about oftentimes it's more important to just let people be where they are and not try to solve a problem at a particular time. Just having the ability to talk about something and share the emotional impact of that and your thinking around a particular thing is more important than trying to solve the problem. And that's really illustrated in a very funny way by the video that's coming up in a little while. Peer support, talked about that. That's peer support with each other. It also, I believe, includes helping peers learn how to interact with each other so that they can provide each other with support. If we can teach kids how to interact successfully with each other, that goes a long way into helping them realize that the world can be a safe place and they can get help from other people in the world. Working with each other and having care for others be a mutual experience is important. And working together has been talked about quite a bit. Empowering people and giving them a choice is a key principle. People who have experienced trauma have had much of their power taken away from them. Children who have grown up in poverty haven't had the same sorts of opportunities that those children who have not grown up in poverty have had, and that decreases their power and their voice and their choice. And us allowing kids or teaching kids where their power lies and doing things like when they one of the examples I like about this is when there's some kids who will say when you ask them what they would like, they would say, I don't really care, whatever. And part of helping them hear their voice or learn their voice is to say, you know what, I don't want you to say that. I really want you to make a choice here. And help them learn that they really do have a preference, even when they may think they may not. Cara talked a lot about the cultural and historical and gender issues in a couple slides ago, and that is another SAMHSA key principle. And we'll talk more about that in subsequent presentations. Whew, next slide. Oh, I didn't even know that was coming next. This would be the time and obviously you could do this stretch break thing whenever you want. And Cara, do you think they may have been taking a break and pausing their thing when we don't know about it? I certainly hope not. No, I'm kidding. This would be a time, if you like, to take a break. This is a quote from Gabor Mate. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. It talks about how people who have experienced stress all their life seek that excitement. And when things aren't stressful, that's uncomfortable to them because it's what they're used to. We seek what we are accustomed to. So if we are accustomed to some peacefulness and time alone, we're going to want that. If we are accustomed to things being chaotic all of the time, peacefulness and quietness can be uncomfortable to us. And that's important to know because many of our kids have grown up in somewhat chaotic environments, and then they tend to create that chaotic environment because that's what they're that's what they're used to. And recognizing that is important because if we respond to chaotic seeking behavior as acting out or misbehavior, we're going to end up giving people a message that is not helpful to them. Next slide. So this is just a whole lot of information on the number of people who experience stress, and I'm not going to go through all of those. You can pause and read them for yourself. The only one I'm really going to talk about is the very last one. 90% of students in level 4 educational settings have experienced trauma. I would argue with that. I'm not exactly sure where that came from, but I would say it is 99.9% if for no other reason than this. I believe that just the process of students being moved to a federal setting for education setting is traumatic in and of itself. I don't think very many of our students would prefer to be in our settings. I think our settings are helpful to kids, but I don't think they want to be there. Kids don't want to have the behaviors and emotions that have resulted in them in being away from their peers. So during the process of our kids being placed in a federal setting they have heard people say to them, you can't be here, you don't fit, you're not good enough to be here, you have to go to this other place for bad kids. I was very careful to say that that's what the kids have heard. I don't believe that that's the message that they have been given, and I don't believe that that's the words that adults used in talking to them about that, but I believe that that's what they hear. And hearing that, even though that's what has not been said, I believe is traumatic for kids. Next slide. The video that's coming up talks about when to push into trauma and when to back off. One of the things that's really important to remember is that there are two things that make people less capable of learning. One of those is experiencing stress. So when people are under a great deal of stress, that part of our brain that's required to make good decisions and make good choices isn't working. And I'm now referring back to that slide that Carr showed on brain development. So that part that in the front prefrontal cortex that lights up, that's where we make our good decisions. And especially when we're under stress, that part of our brain isn't working well. Just a by the way, and don't have to talk about it a lot, is the second thing that really makes people incapable of making good decisions is putting on a pair of hockey skates. I say that because I got myself in a little bit of trouble when I was doing a great big presentation to I think it was pretty much all of the teachers at one of the local school districts, the North St. Paul, Maplewood, Oakdale School District, and I just made that as a joke. I said two things that make people dumb are a high degree of stress and putting on hockey skates. And a lot of the people laughed, and then there was this little group of people off to my right that didn't laugh and got a little bit uncomfortable, and they kind of were doing this thing with their eyes, and they're looking over to their left, to my right. And I looked over then, and I saw this guy who looked kind of mad, and I looked at him and I said, "You're the hockey coach, aren't you?" And he goes, "Yep." And he was a big guy. Thankfully, he didn't push me down. So one of the things that's important to remember is that when people are traumatized and they're having a trauma response, that is not a time to try to teach. That's a time to listen and back off and do things like co-regulate. And we will talk about co-regulation and things like that a lot. We can teach kids about their trauma and about how that impacts them and how they can respond to their trauma at other times, just not when they're upset by it. The response to unsafe and unwanted behaviors needs to be timed. And I already talked about that one. We can't do that just anytime. We've got to choose our times. We've got to choose those teachable moments. Another response that's important is being calm. in one of the later presentations, I'm going to talk about being the second chicken. And that just refers to a study where when chickens are in a situation that may be stressful, one of the things that they'll do is look at other chickens. And if other chickens are acting stressed, they will become stressed. And if other chickens in that situation are not acting stressed, they're just going on with life as normal, then they will not have a stress response. So it's really important for us to go into situations where there's a great deal of tension, being that second chicken. And even though we may feel tense and a little bit afraid, it's helpful if students can look at us and say, oh, they're not stressed out by this. This situation is going to be okay. The next two, safety and teaching, I kind of already talked about in those two things. And again, there are opportunities in this format to ask questions, or even obviously, hopefully, challenge us on some of those things. I really would appreciate it. I do appreciate it when people challenge me on things, because it makes me think, and that can be really helpful. Our students oftentimes exhibit a trauma response when they're overwhelmed because they lack resources. And some of those are emotional resources, and some of those are material resources. Sometimes we expect things of children, particularly now that they don't have. One of the things that's really a challenge when we're doing district learning is equity, because many of our kids don't have a computer. And one of the great things about 916 is we can provide them with a computer. However, one thing we can't always do is provide them with internet access because they may not have Wi-Fi at home. And it's important that we recognize that sometimes kids are overwhelmed and incapable of doing what's helpful for them or what we want them to do, not because of lack of desire, but because of lack of resources. That's how it's always been done. I was, honest to God, I was in a meeting one time and we were talking about doing something differently. And this was when I worked in a day treatment program. We were talking about doing a different kind of intervention with a certain student because they had some needs that we really hadn't encountered before. And a staff person said, we can't do that. We've never done that before. And that still kind of makes me angry. One of the things that's really important for us to recognize is, I'm convinced that this is true. Children now don't live in the same world that I grew up in, and I think most of us has been. The world has really, really changed. Obviously, it's changed because of the two great big recent events, the George Floyd murder and COVID. But even before that, there were two really huge things that have changed our environment. And one of those things is poverty. In 2014, it was the first time in the United States that 51% of the kids in the United States qualified for free and reduced lunch. That means that more than half of the kids in the United States meet at least one of the federal government criteria for living in poverty, and poverty does bad things to kids. And it's not only because they don't have stuff, it's because their parents' ability to be the kind of parents that they want to be is compromised when their parents and their children live in poverty. Another one is media. We have become so incredibly skilled at being mean to each other in an anonymous way that really makes it possible so there are no repercussions for being cruel to each other. And that's had really bad effects on kids who don't have resources because they don't have the ability to cope with that sort of bullying that they often experience online. So in order for us to meet those new challenges, we have to do things in ways that it has not been done before. Restorative practices are a part of doing things a little bit differently. Back in the day, and I probably know back in the day better than most of you, or maybe probably all of you out there, I have more back in the days than you have. The restorative practices are important because implicit in thinking about restorative practices is the belief that the people who need to restore things want to restore them. I can't overemphasize how much I believe that people do not want to be the way that they are when they're doing things that are unexpected. People don't like being that way. And the evidence that I use to prove that is that many of the things that result in them being that way has to do with the things that have happened to them. And that's oftentimes the things that you will see on the items on the ACE study. Just a couple of them are experiencing physical or sexual abuse, or having a family where a family member, a caregiver, has a drug abuse problem, or separation or divorce. No one would choose to grow up in a family like that. Those are the kinds of things that result in those kinds of behaviors. And I think that's really, really proof that people don't want to be that way. Restorative practices acknowledges that, and implicit is teaching people that we know they don't want to be that way. So rather than you go over there and you do a timeout and you feel bad about yourself until you felt bad enough about yourself to come back and rejoin us, the restorative practices do things like, let's do this together and let's fix this. Cara talked about how us working with kids is something that we do with them rather than to them. So when we do a restorative practice, we do with them, and we talk about how we can fix this because we know you want this fixed, rather than go do this punishment. Re-traumatization, I talked about that already. One of the things that we sometimes do when we give kids consequences is re-traumatize them, because just consequences like you go do that inhibits relationship rather than develops relationship. And when we do restorative practices, we hold them accountable for what their behavior has been in a way that enhances the relationship because we do it with them rather than to them. I think both Cara and I have talked enough about that last one, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail in subsequent presentations. So next slide, please. Executive functioning is the thing that happens in the front part of your brain. So if you remember back on that brain slide, the brain on the right hand had the front part of the brain that really wasn't lit up. And that's the part of the brain that's responsible for executive functioning, good decision making. So people who experience trauma, their brains don't work that well. So that means that they have less ability to inhibit responses. So when they see something that they interpret as threatening, they fight or run away or freeze. One of the things that has been amazing to me is I have seen 9-year-old children, both boys and girls, attack police officers that are twice their size, and these cops have had a taser and a gun on their belt. And obviously, they are not going to beat that police officer up. That's going to end badly for them. But the reason that they do that is at that particular time, they are out of their mind with anxiety and fear. And that aggression comes from fear, not from an antisocial or real conduct disordered stance. And so their impulses are inhibited because of the way that their brain works. That also inhibits their ability to shift, to move from one activity to another, because they get stuck on this is what I got to do in this situation because I got to control this situation, and there are no other options for me right now other than to attack, even when it's a police officer. People who experience those kinds of things has less ability to control their emotions and their focus. They have less ability to initiate different kinds of behaviors and are stuck in that same thing. Their working memory. So working memory is this process where people have established patterns of doing things. Driving to work might be a real simple example of that. We drive to work kind of the same direction every time. This summer, there was road construction, and that threw me off because I couldn't go the way that I always go to work, and I couldn't be this mindless drone. I had to think things through, and I ended up finding a way to go to work because of this detour that was even faster, even though I had been doing this for about 5 years. So working memory just can be both a helpful thing and a not helpful thing. The helpful thing is it can give us patterns, and patterns can result in safety. However, when we get too stuck in the same kinds of patterns and don't have the ability to become flexible, that decreases the amount of responses we have at our disposal, and sometimes that limits our ability to be creative. And that happens with people who have experience with trauma. Similar process happens with planning and organization of ideas and organization of materials. A traumatized mind is often a disorganized mind because of people's compromised executive functioning, so they have a less ability to think things through and think sequentially. And so rather than thinking, okay, if I do this first, if I get all my materials together, I've got my pencil, I've got my pen, I've got my computer, I've got a marker, a highlighter, and now I can get down to work because I've got all my stuff here. They just kind of go at it without having the ability to plan. And then they have to interrupt themselves because, oh crap, now I have to go get a marker because I need a highlighter for this particular thing. I would just like to point out at this time that crap is the most kind of bad language that I've used so far, which is really, really unusual for me. If this was live, I would use way worse language. I would not in front of kids. I don't do it in front of kids. Self-monitoring. It's important that people have the ability to look at themselves and evaluate how their behavior is. And that's not going so well for me right now, but I think I'll get through it. And people who have decreased executive functioning have a compromised ability to do that because they are scanning for threat in their environment. And when people scan for threat in their environment, they aren't thinking about how they're behaving nearly as much as what's going on out there. And it's important that people have the ability to self-monitor, because if they don't, they end up saying and doing things that make them look bad, or do unexpected things, and that impacts their relationships with others, both with staff and with peers. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. One of the things that we do is help people learn how to handle concentrated trauma and unsafe behavior. And again, we do that by teaching, but we do that teaching at times when they are not traumatized or not stressed. I think we've kind of talked about that enough. One of the things that's really interesting, and we have to be careful about in terms of our interactions with kids, is not doing for too much. We have to protect people. I would argue, and I've said this before, I would argue that all of the kids that we work with have experienced trauma, if for no other reason that they have been sent to a federal setting for where the bad kids go. And while we have to protect them, at the same time, we have to build advocacy and teach them how to take care of themselves. And if we do too much for them, if we do things for them that they are capable of doing, we give them the implicit and unintended message that they are more incapable than they really are. So we have to find a way to say, go on and do this by yourself, and I'm going to be right behind you, and I'm going to support you in doing it. But we really have to kind of send them out into the world to do that after we have helped them develop skills. The physical environment is amazingly important for them, and as you work at 916, you will note the incredible lengths that the schools have gone to create a safe and pleasant environment. We have, I think it's 3 new schools that you could call brand new. And they think of things like curved hallways or breaking up the environment into smaller bits because the noise doesn't travel as far and kids will be less triggered if there's a commotion in the hallway. Even in our older schools like Bel Air Education Center, a lot of thought has gone into doing what's possible to make it as safe as possible and putting certain groups of kids in one part of the hallway where when they get loud, it will be less impactful on the other kids. And again, even at the Bel Air Education Center, there are a lot of breakout spaces where people can go and feel safe when they need to get away from a larger environment. Problem solving, just being with, is the kind of co-regulation thing that got mentioned and will get talked about more later on. And I believe now is the time to watch the NAIL video.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on.
I think my mic has to be on, sorry. Let me try that over again.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me. And I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there.
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing.
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail.
See, you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just sometimes it's like there's this achy. I don't know what it is. I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Come on, if you would just
don't
try to think my way.
There are just a couple things that I really, really like about that video. And one of them is how funny it is because it is so my wife and I. I got to tell you more about my wife. No, not really. One of the things that I really like about that video is it really does, I think, a pretty funny way, illustrate the importance of just not trying to do something right away. um, and being with people and listening rather than trying to fix it, because that other part will come. When children are not stressed, they do have the ability to kind of go back and talk about the things that have caused their stress. So it's just a really good thing about being with people rather than trying to fix it, because these kinds of things take time. The minimizing the power differentials as appropriate. It's extremely important that the staff people are in charge, because unless the adults are in charge, the environment is not going to be as safe as it needs to be. Additionally, in order for people to feel safe, in order for students to feel safe, staff people have to have the ability to wield their power in kind ways and collaborative ways and ways that empower people. One of the things that I talk to people about kind of a lot is when I hear staff people say, "You can't do that," I cringe, because the response, I have said that to kids dozens of times in my career. And more often than not, the response that I've gotten is, "I just did. What the F are you going to do about it?" And then I'm stuck. And so recognizing the limits of my power is important. And so now I've adjusted my language to say something like, when you do that, that's really not helpful to anybody. It's not helpful to me. And more importantly, it's not helpful to you. Let's figure out a different way that we can do this where this will just feel better for everyone. And figuring that out together is both collaboration and empowerment, because it's including that person in coming up with the solution. It's not just us saying, "This is the way that it's got to be." Excellent. Excuse me. I think I've talked about the role that similarly, including people, in their plan is important, because when people are included in their plan, they have more an investment in it because it becomes theirs. Instilling belief and hope that healing and getting better is possible can be very, very difficult. One of the things that I have found to be somewhat heartbreaking is that students who have come from generations of poverty believe that that is their lot in life, and they will be impoverished because their parents and their grandparents before them have been impoverished. And that's just the way that it's going to be. Instilling hope can be a very, very difficult thing. And it can also be a thing that really, really is possible. It takes time, it takes relationship, and it takes a belief in the that it can happen, and it can happen. I have seen it happen. There's one, if I just say the initials HM, Carl will know immediately who I'm talking about. He is one of the best examples of that. He's a young man who came from a very, 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 very difficult background. And when he was in middle school at Bear Lair Education Center, the expected outcome for him was really, really scary. And I don't like admitting this, but it's true. I believe that most of the people that worked with him believed that he was going to end up in jail. And through some really, really good work with people at 916, He got to the point where he is now working in a job, and he's been there for a while, that pays enough for him to live independently. And that really occurred because people believed in him, and developed a kind of relationship with him that he learned that he really is important, and that he could break that cycle that had been generations, and 3 generations in the making. Acknowledging people and their community and their family experience gives them support and gives them a different community with which to affiliate with. Some of our children have communities that are not helpful to their healthy development. One of the things that 916 can oftentimes do is provide them with a different community. I was on a Zoom meeting yesterday with one of our students, and it was really, really interesting. He's a kid who you would not immediately expect to have formed close relationships with staff, because he doesn't act like that. It's becoming more frequent, and he's more able to kind of acknowledge the importance of staff in his life. But that's a relatively new thing. And when I was on this meeting with him yesterday, he's really into computers, and I believe he's really good at hacking. And he was teasing me that he was going to hack into my personal account, which unfortunately I really wouldn't care that much, because my life ain't that interesting. But for some reason, he wanted to show me some of the passwords he has used for some of his accounts. And his passwords included staff persons from schools' names. And I found that incredibly sweet, because what do we use for passwords? We use our favorite pets. We use their names. And he's using staff persons' names. And I'm talking to him about that, and he goes, no, that's not why I was doing it. It's just because I was with them second period. And that makes absolutely no sense. But while he was denying that he was using their names as kind of an indication of his fondness for them, he had this huge smile on his face. And that smile on his face clearly said, "You busted me, and I'm a little bit embarrassed by it." One of the things that's a little bit more difficult for us at times is to support the entire family. And when we have the opportunity, it's important that we do that. And that can be as simple as calling them every once in a while and saying something sweet about their kids. When my kids were younger, if somebody said something nice about their kids, I liked them immediately. And when we can call parents or just kind of have some sort of interaction where we gush about their kids, it can go an incredibly long way in helping them attach to us and being more likely to listen to us later on when we may have to say something more difficult about their kids, because they know that we've taken the time to get to know the sweet part of their kids. Kids in setting 4, man, their parents have heard so many negative things about their kids that when the phone rings and they recognize that it's from a school number, they cringe. Oftentimes, and I do this, honest to God, I do this. When I call a parent, I will say, "This is Kevin from Johnny's school. I'm not calling about a problem." And most of the time, they will go, "Oh my God, thank God." Because they really expect that it's going to be something bad. And it's important that we make interactions with them, with family members, parents, not have a negative expectation for parents. Excellent. Talked about this one also some. It's important that we acknowledge and we do the best we can to learn about how a person's community supports or impairs healing. Pretty embarrassing example of this is I was talking about a student's impulse to go to where the problem is. So the example, he was telling me that there was a shooting in his neighborhood. And I said, I talked about I said something like, that's got to be really, really scary. What did you do? And I expected him to say something like, well, I went into my room and, isolated or something like that. He said, I went out into the yard to see what was going on. And then he said, it happened like a block away, so I went down the block to kind of check out what's going on and see the commotion. And then I said something stupid like, it's really probably not a great idea to do that because aren't you putting yourself in danger when you go out there? And he looked at me and he said, that's not down the block, that's in my backyard. So my being unaware that that's his life everywhere, I felt really bad about that, and I felt really stupid behind that because he's saying, that's not where I have to go to get this. This happens in my yard, which was really an indication of my lack of knowledge about what his community was like. And I hope to God I never make that mistake again. The disparity and disproportionality of things because of cultural differences, I don't think can be emphasized. And that the previous thing I talked about is an example of that. Another previous thing that I talked about is just people who live in poverty don't have the same resources to do things like do distance learning in the same way. Maybe they're not going to have a computer. Maybe they're not going to have Wi-Fi access. It's important that we learn about those and we acknowledge those and we address the historical factors. Those things, all of those different kind of aspects, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, racism, all impact people, and it's important that we do our best to learn about that, both generally and specifically with our kids. Language goes along with that, and the language that we use is important because I'm really interested in language, and I think I'm really cool when I use big words. And there are some times that works really, really well, and there are other times that increases the distance between myself and some of the kids that I work with. Next slide. Going to talk a lot about secondary trauma and secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue in session 5. Just for this part of it, it's just important to know that this job will impact you, and in some ways it will make your life more difficult, because I believe that we get into this because we like kids and we want to make a difference. And when we learn about how difficult kids' lives are, that's going to make us feel bad. And we're going to want to fix this. And we cannot fix this as quickly as we would like to. I do believe that we can fix this. One of the things that I used to do the outpatient therapy thing, where people came into my office and talked to me for an hour a week. And the thing that I really didn't like about that job is that when I made calls to that kid's school, I knew that they had the ability to impact those kids' lives more than I did when I saw them once a week. And I'm not ripping on outpatient therapy. It's a really, really valuable thing. But I used to see kids for 1 hour a week, at schools, we see kids 6 hours a day. And there is this incredible healing process that occurs just by being with people and being with people in a trauma-informed, trauma-aware way that can have a far greater impact just because it happens so much more often. And in the development of that relationship, it can help kids learn their value in a very, very different and more comprehensive way. That impacts us, however, and being aware of how that impacts us is incredibly important, because unless we're aware of that and we have some methods of managing the feelings that accompany this kind of work with children and families, our own lives are going to be impacted in a way that's not good for us. Much more of that in session 5. I use the kind of terms macro and micro. Most of the stuff that Cara and I have talked about so far is the micro interventions and the micro thinking, and that's how we do this thing in this particular situation. One of the things that I really like about 916 is that 916 thinks a lot about how 916 is as an organization, and a trauma-informed and trauma-aware agency or organization, not just the individuals who provide that. And 916 thinks about not only the trauma that the students have experienced, but also the trauma that staff experience, and ways to address both of those things. I think that's enough on that one. I'm going to turn this back to you. Okay, Cara?
Sounds good. Thanks, Kev. So, again, if you have been following us along in Pear Deck on your slides, please go ahead and take a moment to fill this out. Or if you have not been following along, no shade, just open up the Pear Deck slides so you can respond to this. We're really interested, though, in how this learning has connected to you so far. Obviously, we have 4 more sessions to go, and just for this overview, if you could share with us something interesting that you learned today, and then in some way that you can relate to this material. Research says that if we are able to relate learning to our own life, that it becomes personalized and ingrained then in our practice much more readily than concepts that we feel are foreign or not useful. So again, please take a moment here to fill this out. Your fellow classmates in your cohort will be able to view this, and then Kevin and I will as well, and we will follow up with you on your responses. So you can pause here, fill that out, and once you are finished, you have completed session 1. Thank you so much for your time, and I will be joining you for session 2 and 3. Kevin will be taking over for 4 and 5.
And as of 7:10 last evening, the plan was for you all to participate in some of the in-school trainings. The 2 that I know about are mandatory reporting and some mental health things. I really, really hope that happens. I really do look forward to both meeting you and working with you down the road.
Thanks, team.
That went way longer than I thought.